Welcome back to our study of the book of Esther. Just as a kind of going back to our last time together, where we left off in our study was the kind of culmination of Haman. And, Haman, if you remember, really, in the end, Mordecai was honored by the king, and Haman had to walk him around the city. And so he leaves from doing that just really in despair, and doesn't have a whole lot of time between that and when he heads to Esther's second banquet with the king. So his head is really not necessarily in the right place. But this is the time that we see within chapter 7 that Esther, everything has really come together, that God has really put things in place. And Esther finally reveals that Haman had this plan for all of the Jews to be annihilated, and that she was one of the Jews. And so to have them all killed also meant that the queen of Persia would also be one who would die. And the king reacts, and eventually, kind of in the end, Haman is hung on, ironically, the gallows that he had built the day before for Mordecai. So the irony of all of this is really kind of coming to fruition within this story. And that's where we leave off in chapter 7, kind of where we enter into in chapter 8. Now, the issue is still that though Haman has been dealt with, we still have the edict that has been sent out for the people of God to be killed within kind of a 9-month span. And so we still need to deal with this portion of the emergency. And as we dig into chapter 8, we see how Esther approaches the king with this situation. So jumping into chapter 8, what we're given kind of right off the bat is pretty much right after, it seems, that Haman is dealt with. The king turns to the queen and kind of bequeaths her all of Haman's lands and all of his possessions. Now, the reason that this is really important, and it kind of happens really quickly, is that according to Persian law, one who has betrayed the king, all of their possessions, their land, house, all that kind of stuff is really then kind of given over to the king for him to do with whatever he wants. And he is quick to kind of say, and I think to some degree, kind of distance himself a little bit from Haman. And so he says, he gives Esther all of Haman's lands and possessions, and she kind of in turn gives those things to Mordecai. What does she, as the queen who is living in the palace, really need with all of these lands? And so she gives them to Mordecai instead to rule over. We also see in the front end of chapter 8 that Mordecai is brought in. His direct relationship with Esther is revealed. And then the king does this crazy thing. He gives Mordecai the signet ring that is really kind of the stamp of power of the king. And if you remember, he gave the same ring to Haman just a few chapters before so that Haman could write the edict that said the people of God should be annihilated. And so one of the things that's really interesting about this is that at this moment, the power of the king just seems to be kind of thrown about without much care. The king gives his power really readily and without seeming much thought. But this seems to be also the character of our king, that he doesn't really think through things too much, that as we have seen, he can't really make decisions without other people's influence as well. And so he kind of gives his power over to Mordecai. And I think in some ways also this is another part of distancing himself a little bit from this whole situation. But even with the giving of Haman's land, and even with the giving of the signet ring, we still are in a quandary that Esther needs to take care of. So Esther speaks to the king, and not just speaks to the king, but scripture tells us that at this point, she falls at his feet and weeps and pleads with him. These are very different actions from what we've had before in our character of Esther. Up to this point, she has been very thoughtful. She's been very patient. She's been very calm. What she reveals here is a kind of a desperation, a sadness, pain. You hear the despair and the pain within her as her emotions really kind of bubble to the surface. And I think maybe there's a little bit of concern that though Haman has been taken care of, she has one more opportunity, it would seem, to convince the king to take care of this last part. Because though Haman is dealt with, it means nothing if she cannot also secure the safety of the people of God, of her people, the reason that she has gone through all of this. So we see this deep emotion within her. We see compassion and worry and maybe a little fear. In the midst of that emotion, though, she still seems to address the king with a lot of thought. She uses her words wisely. She has prepared kind of an argument, so to speak, that will best appeal to the king. So she uses some of her words from her previous speech. She kind of, if it please the king, if he has favor of her in any way, then, and pleasing, that's kind of the other portion, then would he revoke the edict and the words of Haman. Now, you would think that this would honestly be pretty easy. The king has said yes to all of Esther's questions and her invites and all that to this point. So it would be pretty easy for us to think that the king would say, okay, yes, well, we revoke the edict. Well, here's where we fall into the problem. And the problem is this. Though the king kind of says, I mean, why do I need to be doing all of these things? You already have Haman's land, but okay. Ultimately, the problem is this. An edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring cannot be revoked. It is a law that cannot be taken back, a law that cannot be changed. So, here's what you need to do. This is a huge snag in the plan. But here's what you need to do. While you can't revoke the edict, the king says, but you can write another one to counter it if you so choose and want to try. So this is what Esther and Mordecai do. Now, at this point, we have a little bit of a shift in the main person of the story. It was Esther. Esther was the one who had been responding kind of in the place of where God wanted her to move, the things that God was directing her to do. And now she's going to kind of take a back seat a little bit. And the person that's going to step forward here is Mordecai. Mordecai is going to be given the authority and the power of the words of the edict. And ultimately, he will be the one with his words who will save the people of God. So they sit down, I guess. He sits down with the scribes and he plans out what his counter edict will be. Now, one of the things I want us to kind of note here, which is just kind of an interesting thing, is between the first edict written by Haman and now Mordecai's edict, there's a 70-day kind of span. This isn't a huge period of time, but it's long enough. But there's still a ton of time left for response of the first edict and for preparation. So here's some things we need to note. Mordecai is the author of this edict. This edict is modeled after the first, but it's a counter to the first. And every detail in this edict is designed with restoration and balance in mind. So here is the words of the edict that we need to hear. Starting in verse 11 of chapter 8. It says this, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them. Take note, the difference here is that the people of God are told they can take up arms only to defend themselves from others. They are in defense. They are not the ones that are pushing out to attack. They are only defending. This is the difference. This is the counter to the first. Now remember, you can't take back and tell the Persians that they cannot fight or try to attack the Israelite people. But in this edict, when they are attacked, the Israelites can defend themselves. He also uses the same words from the first edict, these words of destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. So there's this balance between if one is coming, the Persians are coming to annihilate you, you then have the opportunity in defense to annihilate the one who has come to annihilate you. And it seems kind of crazy, but this counterbalance between both of them kind of creates the restoration that we need here. Scripture also says within the edict that there's this interesting thing that it says children and women included. Now, it would be easy to read here that the people of God, the Israelites, could kill women and children. But that comma within our scripture is actually really important. That pause, that break, is to help the people of God to see your defense is also for the weekend. Your defense is for the ones who cannot defend themselves. While you, as a man, Israelite man, could defend if someone came after you, your responsibility is also to defend those who are weak and cannot defend themselves. This is what this part of the edict is saying. So on the other side, the edict was that the Persians could annihilate anyone, even women and children. Take out every aspect of this group of people. And this edict says that is not possible. And then it goes on to say that you could, as the Israelites, plunder their goods, which is also part of the first edict. So here we have Mordecai's edict is framed in self-defense, while Haman's was undisguised aggression towards the people of God. Mordecai's is violence that's used in response to armed forces, while Haman's was just direct violence against general Jewish people for no reason other than they were Jewish. Haman's was sent by mere couriers, while Mordecai's, interestingly, is sent by mounted royal couriers on the fastest steeds. And I think this is an interesting kind of literary form of the difference between the two that the author wants us to hear. And so here we are. This edict has been written. The parallels of the edict have come together. And as we hear within the last part of chapter 8, the edict has been sent out, and Mordecai is also sent out from the presence of the king, and he kind of enters the city, and he is wearing the fine garments that were supposed to be Haman's. The garments that, in fact, just the day before, or however long it took to write the edict, of weeks before maybe, Mordecai was wearing as he was paraded around Susa by Haman. This power and authority has been given to one who before had absolutely no power and authority. Also, within the first edict, the king and Haman have a drink together, I guess kind of to celebrate the writing of the edict. But there's crying and fasting of the Jewish people as they hear about the edict. In this second edict, there are shouts of joy by the Jewish people. And at the end of this one, there is still kind of a celebration, but it's vastly different with a different group of people. There's still fear at the end of this second edict, but the fear is different now, because really the fear is from both sides. The Jews are worried about how much they may have to defend themselves, and now the rest of the people living in the Persian Empire are worried that the Jewish people may come after them. They're worried and afraid of the Jewish people. In fact, Scripture tells us that some people even declare themselves Jews at the end of chapter 8, whether that's to save themselves or whether there is a true conversion at some point. In some ways, there's still some fear, but now it's on both sides of how will this eventually end up? What will happen as these two edicts kind of face off in a few months? Who will win ultimately in this battle? Well, we find out because we're going to continue on in talking about chapter 9. Here we are, edict pitted against edict. And we find ourselves moving forward into this fateful day within chapter 9. This fateful day that's 9 months from when the second edict was written. What will happen? What could happen on this day? Well, we learn quickly that the reverse occurs, that the Jews gain mastery over those who hated them. There's this phrase within verse 2 of chapter 9. This is kind of how verse 2 goes. It says, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all of the provinces of the king to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all people. This phrase of no one could stand against them is a familiar phrase. In fact, it's found within Joshua 21, chapter 21, and within Joshua chapter 23. This indication that God is fighting for and with his people. There's this understanding, even though God is not mentioned within this whole book, and definitely not within this chapter of the battle, that God is with his people. He is defending them. Their very lives are at stake, and he stands with them. Remember, even though the people of God are not in the Holy Land, their responsibility as the called people of God are to be the representatives of the God of all creation. They are the witnesses of God. This is their role, and their role is being threatened. While we know that God is a warrior God, we don't often want to reference this part of him. It can feel uncomfortable. It can feel contradictory. It feels difficult to pair a God of love with a God who stands in a battle with his people. Yet God is a warrior. But God will always fight and have a space for peace. He doesn't take that lightly. He wants peace for all of his creation, even if they stand against those who have been called and accepted the call. At this point, the warrior God is about saving the very existence of a people group that was aimed to be annihilated, massacred, wiped completely out of the face of the earth. Every people group in the eyes of God is of deep value and worth, and they reflect the God of all creation. God will always stand at the forefront of erasing injustice and hatred. It breaks his heart, but he will stand in those places. And though we don't want to talk about it, justice and mercy always have to go hand in hand. We would never understand the fullness of mercy and grace without also understanding that God is a God of justice. And we don't like to talk about it. It feels uncomfortable. It feels weird. But we wouldn't understand the gift if we didn't understand sometimes the consequences of. These are hard passages of Scripture to wrestle with. The fact that that lives are lost, even if those lives were lives of people who chose to, with full willingness and not force, take the life of someone else. It breaks God's heart. As we continue within chapter 9, we see, interestingly, that there becomes kind of a fear of Mordecai. It seems that maybe within these 9 months that Mordecai has kind of risen in power a little bit. Maybe the officials have seen something different within him. And so they don't just kind of stand back, but they kind of help within the city capital of Susa to make sure that the Jewish people are protected. So there's really a shift here, not just within power, but within kind of the value of the people of God. We learn within Scripture that just within Susa, on the day of the battle, 500 men are killed. And they only say, kind of the Persian side, this is no record, there's no record within our Scripture of how many Jews also lost their lives. And we can be guaranteed that there were probably some of those as well. Scripture also tells us that the 10 sons of Haman lose their lives on that day as well. Maybe they were out to vindicate their father who died 9 months before. Maybe they got caught up. All we know ultimately is that everyone within the family line of Haman is now gone. But here's one thing that's kind of interesting about what happens on the day of the battle. Remember, the edict, the second edict, mirrored the first in saying that the people of God could plunder anyone's things if they were attacked and killed, all that kind of stuff. But they don't. In fact, Scripture tells us 3 times that they don't plunder anything. They don't take anyone's possessions. Why? Why would this be significant that you have to list it 3 times within this chapter? In fact, it's not just within this chapter, but they say it towards the end of this chapter and even into chapter 10. Why? Why is this important? Well, I think the author is trying to say that there's a statement of opposition to Israel's enemies. Interestingly, within the Old Testament, no Gentile army has ever been described as having the restraint to avoid plundering a nation they have defeated. But Jews, I guess the Jewish people, felt they didn't need the personal enrichment, that God's protection in Persia and beyond was of greater asset. At this point within redemptive history, God has different expectations for Israel's relationship with the Gentile nations. And on a really practical note, this also helps to kind of for the appeal of the Jewish people to all other cultures of people who are still within the city. That there was grace and mercy, that they didn't feel they needed, all they needed to do was defend themselves. They didn't need anything else. And so that action speaks volumes to those who are watching and what it could do for the appeal to the God of all creation is huge. We see as we go on in chapter 9 that there's this interesting encounter between the king and Esther again. The king kind of seems to be a little bit in shell shock of what happens on the day of the battle. Now remember, he was not a part of either writing of the edict. And remember, at first, in the first edict, he didn't even know what people group Haman was suggesting that would be annihilated. He doesn't learn until Esther comes along and they have the banquets of what people group. So he has no idea of the extravagance that could happen of this battle. But he finds out on the day of the battle when 500 just within the city have been killed, and we don't even know how many within the provinces around in Persia have also lost their lives. So I imagine the king is a little bit kind of flabbergasted by all that has happened. And he says to the king, so in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men. So what is it that you want now? What further is your question? It shall be fulfilled. And here we have Esther's response. Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. Esther's response is very interesting this time. There's no kind of buttering up phrase, if it please the king, if I find any favor, all that kind of stuff. She cuts straight to the point in this response. And it would also feel a little bit like Esther maybe bloodthirsty at this point. Maybe why give the Jews one more day to potentially kill others? But remember, day 2, the same rules apply as day 1. The Jews can only defend themselves against attack. She must have in some way known that the potential of attack was still great on day 2, that people would still feel such anger and malice potentially towards those, towards the Jews, because maybe they had lost someone. And she also kind of leaves it only to Susa, where really the most unrest and to some degree most power would have sat. So the king agrees. And in that second day, we find that really she made a great appeal, because 300 more lives are lost that day. If the Jews had not been allowed to defend themselves on day 2, how many lives of the Jews would have been lost in retaliation? So she must have thought this through. She must have known of the anger of the people. But then there's the second part of her request, this part about putting the sons of Haman on the gallows. Remember, they died on the day before, so why would we need to also hang them on the gallows? This would just seem vindictive or pointless. But both her requests had deep points. One was a point of substance, and the other was a point of symbol. See, such impaling was the height of humiliation at the time, the ultimate degradation of warfare. What Esther does by asking if the sons of Haman would be placed on the gallows was basically kind of a legal basis to deter more fighting. That this is what happens in the opposition of the Jewish people. And what she does here with this request is secure the safety of the Jewish people for I don't even know how many years to come. She has fulfilled in this time what Mordecai begged her to do, but really I think what God placed her in the right place at the right time to do. To protect her people, not just for one day, but for many, many years to come. One person. This is what one person can do. We're going to stop right here and finish up chapter 9 and chapter 10 and kind of wrap up our time together in our next lesson. But here's one of the things I want you to hear as we kind of finish our time together, and it's this. Esther, as one person, had the ability to speak power and authority and salvation for her people. But it also, all of this started with one person. It started with Haman, with one man's anger that turned into pure hatred and vindictiveness of a whole people group that amounted to so many losses of lives on both sides. What was this anger worth? One decision can lead to so much devastation. One moment of hatred unchecked can lose lives. One of the things that this chapter reveals to me is that my actions have ramifications, ones that maybe I could never know about. My anger and my potential hate has the ability to kill. The death could be a loss of a relationship, could be the loss of a job, or it could be the loss of life. I have the ability to bring life and speak life, or to speak death. And my actions have the same ability. I think one of the most powerful things about the book of Esther is what Esther does early in the book when she stops and she fasts and she listens to God. And she doesn't just listen to God for 1 hour. She sets aside 3 days to do nothing but hear from God. to evaluate what he's saying and speaking to her and calling her to do. And then, once she hears, she is obedient to go and do. She's careful with her words. She's thoughtful with the decisions that she has to make. She knows that life is in the balance, and she doesn't take that lightly. Influence is power, but that use of power needs to be carefully cultivated. We need to ask ourselves, if God were standing right here, face to face with us, what would he do? How would he act? The fact is that knowing the character of God, deeply, deeply having it rooted within us, we would act as he would. We are his hands and his feet. And as we have established, our God is about life, full, abundant, meaningful life, and a life that hopefully is connected and reflective of him. What words and actions do we have, or do we do, that bring about more life? One life has influence. It has even more influence when that life is directed by the God of all creation. But we don't take that influence lightly. We don't use it quickly. We don't throw it around. We listen to God. We listen patiently and we wait and we are directed by the Spirit of God, and then we step in. That's the power of the story of Esther. One person can have deep influence, for good or for evil. Where do we stand? Come back next week as we finish out this book together, as we continue to see what God is teaching us, where he's pushing us, what he's molding us for, so that we can go out and be his hands and feet. See you guys later.